Welcome to another episode of our video series of the Philosophical History with Contemporary Critique.
It's wonderful to be back, ready for some intellectual heavy lifting today. How are you holding up with the sheer volume of material we have to process?
I'm excellent. I've had my coffee, and I am ready to grapple with what is perhaps the most ancient and, still the most frustrating philosophical subject, evil.
Exactly, the problem of evil. It's so persistent, precisely because it resists any kind of clear definition. We all think we know what it is, but the deeper you look, the more slippery the concept becomes.
Especially when you try to apply it to real human actions.
Yes, absolutely.
And the material we've gathered here, it just completely challenges that simplistic, almost cartoonish notion of evil. We have to move beyond the archetype of the villain, the figure with the pitchfork, the maniacal laugh.
Or just the excessive visible rage.
Exactly. Our mission today is to ask what evil really is and, crucially, how it functions in the modern world. We're looking for those nuggets of knowledge that can redefine this ancient concept for you.
And this leads us right to the core conflict, the central contradiction we have to analyze. Yeah. Despite the undeniable existence of destructive and terrible acts throughout all of history, almost no one identifies themselves as the bad guy.
Not outside of bad fiction, anyway.
Right. Everyone, deep down, believes they're doing something right, or at the very least, something necessary for survival or progress or justice.
So the big question is, if we all universally deny being evil, where does evil actually originate?
And that's where the philosophical struggle truly begins. The initial sort of common assumption is that evil must be an individual thing, a pathology.
Like the angry neighbor or the jealous rival, someone who's just innately cruel.
And for centuries, that was the dominant framework, right? It was all about individual moral failing.
Absolutely. But that assumption was fundamentally challenged. I mean, you could argue it was shattered in the mid-20th century.
Following massive world events.
Specifically, the industrial-scale atrocities of World War II. The philosophical focus just shifted dramatically. The question wasn't, why are certain individuals inherently bad?
Or mad, or sadists.
Right. The question became, how do structures and systems create the conditions for evil? An evil that's often carried out by seemingly normal people.
That structural shift is fundamental. It means evil isn't necessarily a passionate act of malice.
It's institutionalized. It's an administrative decision.
Precisely. I mean, think about large organizations, government agencies, military hierarchies.
Massive corporations.
Exactly. People acting within these defined segmented roles can commit acts that are objectively devastating, but they don't define themselves as wicked. They're just performing their function.
They're adhering to policy, following orders.
Or maximizing efficiency within the system. Their preoccupation is with internal success metrics, not with moral self-reflection.
Their moral focus is truncated.
That's a great word for it. They might be an excellent accountant, or an efficient manager, or a highly loyal soldier. Their justification isn't based on an internal desire to harm, but on the external requirement to fulfill their job description.
And this is how that universal denial of evil really functions. Even those committing terrible acts feel they're doing something good for their group, their company, their nation.
And this deep, almost universal aspiration toward goodness, even if it's superficial, is a crucial clue to understanding how the most pervasive forms of evil can persist.
Okay, so if that's the case, if roles and functions are key, then we really need to sharpen our definition of what bad even means. We have to differentiate between what we'd call moral evil.
The intentional wish for cruelty.
Right. That and something else.
Exactly. We need to distinguish moral evil from what we can call non-moral evil, which is really just a lack of quality, a deficiency in function, or a failure to meet a standard.
Let's use the concrete analogy from the sources here because it's so powerful. The bad microphone.
Perfect. If I call a microphone bad, it's not morally evil. It hasn't sinned. It has simply failed its function. It lacks the necessary quality. It's deficient.
And that distinction is incredibly clarifying. It lets us step away from the paralyzing weight of personal moral judgment,
which almost always defaults to blaming individuals.
Yes, and instead lets us analyze performance, function, and systemic deficiency.
This also gets at a common frustration, I think, the reduction of true goodness solely to good-heartedness, the person who means well.
The person who wouldn't harm an ant, who is just innately sweet. That sentimental definition feels so cheap, doesn't it?
It drastically lowers the value of true goodness. A virtue. When we reduce goodness to some innate, sentimental quality, something you just have, it requires no effort, no training, no commitment.
You just are good.
And the sources argue that true virtue requires the exact opposite. True virtue, or excellence, requires work. It demands planning, effort, commitment.
Whether that's in your craft, your relationships, or your civic duties.
Absolutely. If you're merely good-hearted and you rely on that sentiment, you don't actually have to work on anything. You can be incompetent, lazy, ineffective, but still feel morally superior because your intentions were pure.
And that is a massive philosophical trap.
It is. Goodness must be effective. It has to be high quality, or it risks becoming a form of non-moral evil, a failure of function.
This emphasis on effort and quality, it explains why the structure of certain ancient belief systems had such a profound impact. Western culture, for instance, heavily influenced by systems like Christianity.
Oh, absolutely.
It relies on a framework of inherent evil original sin, which then requires a very narrow, difficult path to salvation. The focus is on overcoming an innate defect.
And that concept of defects radically changes how you approach life. You have to contrast that with, say, the ancient Greek understanding of virtue, of arte. For them, virtue wasn't some painful tightrope walk to avoid damnation.
It was functional excellence.
Exactly. It was a deeply ingrained habit, a character trait you developed over time through practice. Once you had it, it wasn't easily lost. And it was intrinsically linked to human fulfillment, to flourishing.
You worked on it because it made you a better functioning human being, not just because it saved your soul.
Which is actually supported by the historical root of our own language, which I find genuinely surprising.
It's one of the best nuggets we extracted, I think.
It really is. Across many Indo-European languages, English, German, and others, the original words for good conveyed meanings related to usefulness, health, soundness, strength.
Something that was good was effective.
Precisely. And conversely, words for bad often meant worthless, empty, or weak. Lacking quality, the moral content, the idea of good hearts and evil hearts, that was secondary. It was added much later in history.
So if the definition shifts from function back toward this idea of an innate feeling, we have to revisit that primal question. Is evil innate? I mean, we often hear the argument that humans are fundamentally selfish. Our baby is just tiny, self-interested maximizers.
Well, anthropologically and psychologically speaking, the argument that humans are fundamentally selfish it's deeply flawed.
How so?
Just consider the human infant. They are arguably the most dependent mammal on Earth. They are not independent agents capable of calculated self-interest. They exist in a whole with the parent. They are profoundly relational.
They're seeking connection for survival, not maximizing personal gain.
Exactly. The selfishness we see in adulthood is often a learned response, a coping mechanism, or a product of specific social structures. It's not some innate, fully formed impulse we're born with.
That is a critical reversal. So evil isn't something born in the heart. It's something that grows through structural, social, or functional deficiency.
Which brings us to how we deploy these moral labels in contemporary conflicts. When leaders label an opponent, whether it's a rival nation or a terrorist group, as purely evil.
That label is often reciprocal. The other side labels them the same way.
Yes, and it turns what might be a complex political struggle into a moral crusade. It's why legal experts struggle so much to even define terrorism in international law. The term is often just a high-stakes moral weapon.
And here's the true critical thinking challenge the sources raise. The very concept of moral evil, applying that ultimate label itself, provides a dangerous rationale for committing future acts of cruelty.
That is the deepest insight we have to internalize. Vigilance against labeling is absolutely key. If you declare someone pure evil, unforgivable,
Beyond redemption,
then any subsequent action you take against them, no matter how brutal, is automatically justified in your mind. We have to be intensely suspicious of the ease with which we apply that judgment.
because it's often a justification for violence, not an accurate description of reality. Let's look at a text that illustrates this organizational requirement for internal order. The Godfather films. It's fiction, but it's brilliant sociological commentary.
It's fascinating because the fictional organization doesn't thrive just on external violence. It thrives on a rigid internal order and discipline. It establishes its own system of justice where the state fails.
But the paradox is that for a bad organization to survive, it requires internal virtues.
Exactly. Its longevity requires loyalty, commitment, discipline, a strange form of ethical code. A demonstrably destructive organization cannot survive through complete internal betrayal and chaos.
And when those internal rechus collapse, when they start killing family, betraying the code for pure self-interest,
That's when the organization starts to fail. It shows that even structured evil needs an internal system of goodness, of order and quality just to function.
that connects us perfectly back to our definition of non-moral evil as lacking quality. So what's the ethical status of everyday objects in our global economy, like this microphone or the smartphone you might be listening on?
Are they morally charged?
Huh?
They absolutely are. This is the great contemporary ethical headache that ties structure and quality together. Our demand for high-quality electronics, fast fashion, cheap food.
It requires rare earth minerals, manufacturing labor. It all comes from hidden exploitation. Dangerous conditions thousands of miles away.
We enjoy a massive level of global prosperity, but it's maintained by a distance from the ethical cost.
Precisely. So when the production of an object relies on unsafe labor or resource conflicts, we have to ask, is the object itself ethically charged, even if it functions perfectly for us?
The object's technical quality, its functional excellence, is intrinsically linked to a profound structural deficiency and ethical failure in the supply chain.
So the microphone might be a perfect object of functional excellence.
But its perfection required a form of non-moral evil systemic deficiency, exploitation, to come into being. The consumer becomes an unknowing participant just by consuming.
This has been a complete restructuring of the concept, moving it from the heart of an individual to the complexity of global systems. To summarize our key takeaways for you, evil is often structural, simple moral labeling is dangerous, and true goodness requires effort and quality, not just feeling.
And this brings us back to the most critical action item. Instead of wasting our energy asking, am I a bad person? Which only triggers shame and defensiveness.
And leads to a closed mind.
Right. The more productive question is, if I were deficient or participating in a deficient structure, what tools would I need to realize it? We need to work on the capacity for radical, unsentimental self-reflection.
It's not about finding a verdict on your moral standing. It's about improving the diagnostic tools you have to monitor your own quality.
And that leads to the final provocative thought, which philosophers studying this often bring up. To truly look at ourselves without bias, we have to take a vacation from fear and shame.
A vacation from fear and shame.
Yes, fear tells us we might be caught. Shame tells us we're irredeemably flawed. If we can put those two powerful emotions aside, even for a moment, we can ask the hardest questions about our own roles, our assumptions, and our participation in structural deficiency.
So we ask you, are you willing to put aside the fear of what you might find and sincerely ask those hard questions about your own quality and contribution?
Because the development of true virtue demands that honest, unflinching look. And it is the necessary prerequisite to recognizing and dismantling the structures of evil hiding in plain sight.